Hey community, welcome to our sermon podcast for wanderers, seekers, and thinkers, for deconstructing and reconstructing. This is a feed of Open Door Church, a faith community focused on God's love and grace, a progressive church built around action, community, and people. Enjoy this week's message and check back often as we're posting new content every week.
We've been doing the dangerous work of looking into liberation theology. And as I shared, and I'll just do a little bit of a recap, as I shared coming into this is something that is dear to me, specifically because I came to a place in my life that faith and tradition and what had been the answers that were being given to me just didn't add up to everything. And I couldn't take my experience and what I see and pull it into the story or the overarching narrative that church had taught and told me, and that tradition had told me how to believe and create a worldview that worked. And so in that story, as I moved along, liberation theology is a place that I found a home, a place that I found where I could question the things that I needed to question and move forward in a way that I felt healthy and real and authentic, and allowed me to move through those really difficult times and come out with something that I could rebuild, faith rebuild, theology rebuild, something that made sense as I read through Scripture and added things together that I had previously missed, and it allowed me to sort of be. It allowed me to be here now and to continue to dig into my own faith and my own journey. So that's sort of a bit of how we got to this place and why I find it necessary, even though it informs much of what I speak on or how I look at Scripture. I thought that it would be good for us to just really open it up and call it what it is, and to allow you to see sort of the depths of how that works out. So last week we actually looked at the way we dig into Scripture and the way we view Scripture. Part of what makes liberation theology is the way that we read Scripture. And any theology for that matter, it really often comes down to its core at a place of how we're interpreting either Scripture or life around us. And then secondly, the lens, the perspective that we come to the table with as we read Scripture. And liberation theology is no different. The perspective that one comes to the table with from a liberation theology point of view would be essentially the place of poverty, the place of the poor. This morning I want to name a couple of things, and then we'll continue down this sort of path of identifying elements of what this does, and then how we go about discovering our own process. And the great thing about this, okay, so you can take or leave liberation theology on the whole. You can take or leave pieces of liberation theology. This is what makes your journey and allows you to. Maybe you don't like the outcome, but you like the process of digging into something in a way that you haven't done before. This is what that's about. This is the process of digging in. So much of what we're doing could be applied across the spectrum of theological perspectives. It could be applied from different points of view, even different religions, but the ideas of how we do that can still be drawn from liberation theology. Gustavo Gutierrez, one of the maybe you could say early thinkers that actually named the movement in his book, Theology of Liberation. But I'm drawing from a later book, The Power of the Poor in History. He says two things have been critical in the development of liberation theology, and at the core from the very beginning. And the first one is something that we're going to do today, and the second one we just named, but I'll name it again here. This is the first one is liberation first. Liberation first, theology second. Now, well, I'll give you the second one just so you're not hanging on the edge of the cliff here. The second one is that the viewpoint is from the place of poverty or from the place of the poor. So the idea that God is incarnate in a infant, but then also in the place of poverty and moves through life and understands the world even through the place of poverty is significant. But today we're going to spend our time with the first one. Liberation first, theology second. I grew up in a tradition, and I think many of us grew up in a tradition, and there's a reason for this, that was heavily, let me get my words together here, that was heavily weighted toward doctrine. And by that I mean heavily weighted toward your mind and your thought process and your ability to believe and all of the things that come in place after that. Let me explain what I mean by heavily weighted toward. And some of you, to be honest, are going to have a hard time with this concept, but I want you to just bear with it, allow it to sink in, allow it to settle and be. By weighted, I mean that we begin with doctrine. We begin with theology. We begin with our brain and let the theology work itself out. Maybe that's through reading scripture. Maybe that's through tradition and reading theology from centuries of those who have worked on it. But regardless, the point is we go, okay, how do I do my theology? How do I form my doctrinal statements, my personal set of beliefs? And then the question, here's what makes this fascinating. The second question is then, now that I have my theology, now that I have my beliefs, now that I have my doctrinal statements, I can then apply them to how I live and be in the world. Liberation theology flips this upside down and says, actually, practice is extremely significant. Nothing is done in a vacuum. We don't do theology in a vacuum. We don't think through what is in a vacuum. We actually should begin with practice and liberation, and then allow our theology to be informed through the process of practice and theory. It's not theory and then we figure out how we apply that theory. It is practice and theory work side by side so that we can dig in and uncover what this is and how theology pulls and draws from our practice. The reason this matters in this specific context is that without beginning here, or maybe we don't think about practice at all, we only do theology. We can watch and we can look through history at the ways in which theology has unfolded into practice, and often our practice, justified through our theology, is quite frightening. It is harmful, it is damaging, it destroys communities or entire nations even. We can look at essentially the salvation theology and the way that it has played out in the world. The Crusades are a direct result of salvation theology. death, destruction, despair, everything coming out of a theology of salvation. And you go, okay, so either it's been applied wrong, which you could argue, or we need to take into account what a theology is applied and how it gets applied. And if it's getting applied improperly, maybe there is something wrong with the theology itself. Lastly, or partly in this mix of why practice matters, is that nothing is done in a vacuum. The context in which we do theology is as significant as the theology itself. So to explain this, you might look over the last 60 years at the theology that has come out of North America, the church that has come out of North America, churches, to be fair. That theology comes from a place of life. The German phrase that often gets used in interpreting Scripture or in understanding Scripture is Sitzenleben, meaning the setting of life. We're digging into the setting of life within Scripture, but also from our place in life, we read that Scripture and we interpret that Scripture. It is incredibly significant to read from the place of poverty rather than the place of wealth and power. It is significant in how we read and how we develop our theology if we are reading from a place of power, if we are reading from a place of marginalization. The two, just to name the extremes, to read the story of the gospel from a wealthy position versus reading the story of the gospel from a third world country, or from the place of poverty, or from in prison. All of those affect the way that we read. And in so much so that liberation theology says, look, we have to deal with the local, with the particular, with the real, with the context first. And in the process, we find theory, we find theology, we find doctrine. And we can't separate the two, which is what has traditionally been done. In hopes, to be fair, separating the two is an effort to, in hopes, find the right thought, orthodoxy, the right theology, and then we can carry that out and we can apply it across the entire globe. One universal theology. If we get it right, it will be applied across the entire globe. But we form that one right theology from a particular and specific place, from a context that is in the world. And it matters what that context is. Now, I was explaining that my tradition was very head-oriented. Let me just pause, because I've shared pieces of my own tradition over the last few weeks, and not great stories, to be honest. Next week, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I loved about my tradition and how I got here in part because of that tradition. But right now, that tradition led me to a very head-oriented theology, head-oriented faith, and head-oriented practice. What that does is leads us place to ignoring those who are on the margins. If my purpose, if my goal, if my thought process of reading Scripture is to come to orthodoxy, is to come to right thought, there is additional steps. That is the wholeness of faith. And then there are additional steps. Now let's talk about practicing faith. This is my faith. It's the right thought. It's the right thing. Everything I've been working toward is thought-oriented or governed around my head and my belief system. But then you go, okay, now that we've done that, we can talk about practice. We can talk about what it means to gather as a church. We can talk about what it means to go and serve from the place of the church. But in doing so, we've prioritized our heads. We've prioritized our minds. We've prioritized theology without practice. Now, aside from the fact that thought processes are also in part a place of privilege, that it leaves people on the margins who think differently or think outside or come from a different perspective or who are not able to voice those thoughts. It places people on the margins simply because we've prioritized doctrine. In addition, we've prioritized doctrine that comes from a place in the North, in North America, that comes from a place of privilege. We can watch these shifts in history. We can see that orthodoxy at a moment in time included care for justice and for those on the margins. But as the church brought more and more wealth and power into it, those things began to be sidelined. And specifically, scripture that prioritized these things began to be moralized rather than practical things. Let's talk about a few of those. Justo and Catherine Gonzalez write I've referenced at least one of the last 2 weeks, their book Liberation Preaching, I think it's called. And one of the things that I find so fascinating about this is that their identification of places, minor places that you have to look, that you have to uncover in translation and in things like our lectionaries that allow us to see the ways in which women's voices are marginalized, see the ways in which people in poverty are marginalized, see the ways in which we have spiritualized things like justice to serve our own ends. That's a strong word, to serve our own ends. But you can see the subtleties. And I don't think this is always, sometimes certainly, but it's not always done with malice. It is done from our lens, from our perspective. And in our perspective, from places of wealth and power, it is sometimes hard to see beneath the surface. So let's look at just one of these scenarios that this occurs. I skipped a passage I was going to read about. We'll come back to it. Hopefully it makes sense then. And I've lost another passage we were going to read on. No matter. It's okay. It's all still here. We're going to move to 2 Corinthians. We were in Matthew. You didn't know that because I skipped it in my excitement about my own tradition. But we're going to skip to now 2 Corinthians, and we're in chapter 6. Now here's the piece of identification that Gonzalez and Gonzalez make for us. The word in Greek that is translated as justice can also be translated as righteousness. Now think about those two words and the way we use them. I'll give you a few seconds. The same word in Greek, this is a problem with translations and the way that we do things. The same word in Greek that can be translated as justice can be translated as righteousness. One word, two English meanings for us. Did you take your time with that? Justice and righteousness. Now let's read and the way that something might play out as we read. So we're in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. See now that we are putting no obstacle in anyone's way, so that no fault may be found with our ministry, but as servants of God, we have commended ourselves in every way, through great endurance, in afflictions, hardships, calamities. We're going to skip a few of these because he goes on and on. In knowledge, in patience, and kindness. And then verse 7, in truthful speech and the power of God, with the weapons of righteousness for the right hand and for the left, in honor and dishonor. And then continues down in verse 14, do not be mismatched with unbelievers, for what partnership is there between righteousness and lawlessness? Or what fellowship is there between light and darkness? But if we flip those two words, you have a completely different understanding of how this passage reads. Let's try again. We are putting no obstacle in anyone's way so that no fault may be found with our ministry. But as servants of God, we have commended ourselves in every way. In truthful speech, verse 7, and the power of God with weapons of justice for the right hand and for the left, in honor and dishonor, in ill repute and good repute. And verse 14, for what partnership is there between justice and lawlessness? Justice in that sentence actually changes what the word lawlessness means. It changes what it means to be mismatched. It changes what it means to have truthful speech when the follow-up is not simply righteousness, but is justice for the right hand and the left. Honor is reinterpreted through the lens of justice when righteousness is replaced. It may not surprise you that throughout history, interpreters that carry with them power and or wealth interpret this scripture, these two passages, with the word righteousness. On the flip side, interpreters that read from the margins or are in the margins themselves, from the place of poverty or powerlessness, read this and interpret that word as justice. You see, the point here is that the local context, the way in which liberation is tied specifically, the act and the process and the practice is tied with the theory and the theology. They cannot be separated because we tend to fail in our ability to do that. So we think about practice first. We think about the actions of God liberating the Israelites in Egypt. We think about every single statement, many statements about God that follow in claiming, making theological claims throughout the Hebrew Scripture. This statement is, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Do you see that theology and action are tied close together? that it is practice, it is the liberative act that is tied to the theological conclusion, that they are not separate. This is part of what makes liberation theology. It is tending to practice and the real world, the on-the-ground world of what occurs in Scripture and in life. We have a tendency to do theology up here, yet it is on the ground that theology is formed in the process of liberation theology. And as I said at the outset, you can leave liberation theology and things around it behind. But I implore you to consider, to reevaluate the way in which you do and form your own theology. If nothing else, you may use practice as a check and balance. Not that we have checks and balances anymore, but you may use practice as a check and balance to your own theology. What is the practice or the form or what comes out, flows out of my theology? Is it harmful? Is it destructive? Is it degrading? Does it leave people on the margins? How is it received by others? In what ways does it elevate my own privilege? Liberation theology asks from the other side of how we're forming our theology. It says practice matters. The context matters. Does theology liberate? As we noted in the first one of these conversations, Jesus begins ministry in Luke by saying, I have come to set the oppressed free. Does our theology do that? Does our theology liberate? And maybe if we focus on setting the oppressed free first and allowing our theology to be formed from that practice, from that action, from that active work in the world, we come to very different conclusions about what theology gets formed, who God is, how God works in the world. Maybe if we remind ourselves in each instance that we claim the name of God, that God is the God who brought the oppressed people from the land of oppression. That is part of the on-the-ground work that happens in liberation theology. Just to leave you with a moment here, because I skipped the Lord's Prayer. But I would like you to hear within the Lord's Prayer the on-the-ground practice that happens. We tend to spiritualize our work and our efforts and our theology. Jesus says in Matthew 6, pray then in this way, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. From the viewpoint of a liberation theologian, that one line, on earth as it is in heaven, is a call to bring the kingdom, the values of justice and liberation and compassion and grace and love into our context on the ground. You remove that line and it changes the way in which this prayer is read. It changes the way in which our practice is done and in which our theology is formed. If the Exodus is a story that is remembered, it is simply history. But if it is a consistent recollection to the God who liberates, it is practice and theology forming on the ground, in person. And what we notice is that as Jesus talks, in this moment, the prayer is, bring your kingdom. Allow us to participate in bringing your kingdom here as well. And then everywhere that Jesus goes, Jesus is consistently bringing those values of love and justice and concern for those on the margins down to earth currently, presently. After Jesus finishes the Sermon on the Mount, we move immediately to Jesus cleansing a leper. Jesus heals a centurion's servant. Jesus heals at Peter's house. Slowly but surely, Jesus moves in and out of the lives of people who have been placed on the edges of their community, brings them back to life and brings community with it. Real action, real liberation. And I love how we get these moments about fasting or about washing the disciples' hands, or about the moment when he heals on the Sabbath in the synagogue. And he's asked, where is it? He's asked, is it right to heal on the Sabbath? Is it okay to pluck grain? But Jesus' theology even is being formed with practice. It is inherently tied to the liberative acts that he continues throughout his ministry. Something that could be construed as religious legalism is then left to the side in order to actually, on the ground, real life, liberate someone from the oppression of the world. That is why practice comes with theory in the liberation theology. It is why it is significant. It is why that as we do theology without acknowledging the world around us, we lack the ability to see our own lens in the process. We're going to pause there for the week. When we come back next week, I'll tell some positive things about my tradition, but also we'll dig in a bit further about how we do this and how this theology takes place. And I'd like to reiterate one last time. I'm not here to convince you of liberation theology. I'm here to expose you to a new way to read and understand Scripture, a new way of interpreting and challenging your own biases, a new way of evaluating the work that you've done over years or decades to develop your practice, your faith, your theology, and to allow that to sit with us, to challenge us, to bring about change within us.
Thanks for listening to this sermon podcast from Open Door Church. Our intro and outro music was created by Lee Rosevere and is used under a Creative Commons by attribution license. Have a great week. Ask the hard questions and explore God's love. Everyone is always welcome to join the journey with us at Open Door. Learn more at opendoorfamily.ca. That's opendoorfamily.ca.